he didn't recognize Billy the Kid, who was in the bar with him. And so then Billy asked if he could see his gun, and so he let him have his gun, and Billy rotated the chamber, or took out a bullet, or rotated the chamber to an empty cylinder, and then handed it back to him.
History tells us Billy the Kid died in a dark room at Fort Sumner in 1881 and was buried before sunrise. But what if the most famous outlaw in the American West never truly stayed in that grave? For more than a century, floods, missing records, stolen tombstones, disputed identities, and blocked DNA investigations have fueled a growing suspicion that nobody actually knows where William H. Bonney's coffin ended up. Some believe his remains were washed away by the Pecos River. Others insist the wrong man was buried from the beginning. And every failed attempt to uncover the truth has only deepened the mystery surrounding Billy the Kid's final resting place. The initial burial and immediate aftermath. You would think an outlaw as infamous as William H. Bonney would be paraded through the streets, photographed, and autopsied. Instead, we got a midnight shooting in a dark room and a body rushed into the dirt before the sun fully rose. On the night of July 14, 1881, inside the pitch-black bedroom of Pete Maxwell at Fort Sumner, Sheriff Pat Garrett pulled the trigger. The man known as Billy the Kid fell dead to the floor. At least, that is the official narrative presented to the world. Think about the immediate aftermath for a second. In the late 19th century, high-profile outlaws like Jesse James and members of the Dalton Gang were subjected to public viewings and post-mortem photography. The public demanded visual proof when a legendary fugitive was brought down. Yet, for the most notorious outlaw in the American Southwest, there was no formal medical autopsy performed. There was no surviving photograph taken of the corpse to verify identity. By the early morning hours of July 15th, just hours after the gunfire ceased, the body was already prepared for interment and lowered into the earth. The sheer haste of this midnight burial created a massive vacuum of evidence that continues to baffle historians. The chosen resting place was a small civilian plot tucked inside the old Fort Sumner Military Cemetery. This location was already falling into a state of severe decay as the United States Army was actively disengaging from the frontier post. Deluvina Maxwell, a prominent local resident, stood by and explicitly witnessed these incredibly hasty funeral proceedings. She watched closely as Bonney was laid to rest in what quickly became known as the Regulator Plot. He was purposefully flanked by his fallen comrades from the brutal Lincoln County War, Charlie Beaudre and Tom O'Folliard. Beaudre had violently met his end at Stinking Springs in December 1880, and O'Folliard had fallen in battle shortly before that. It served as a symbolic final gathering of outlaws in the harsh desert dirt. You might logically expect a permanent monument for such a legendary historical figure. The reality was a rudimentary wooden cross fashioned together from a few of Pete Maxwell's old fence posts. In the harsh, wind-driven environment of the high plains of New Mexico, wood was an incredibly scarce commodity. That flimsy marker was completely vulnerable to the unforgiving elements. It rapidly succumbed to natural rot, severe wind erosion, and scavenging. Worse still, intoxicated local cowboys frequently used the wooden cross for target practice during drunken nights out, effectively erasing the exact verifiable location of the grave forever. This heavy atmospheric secrecy and total lack of a permanent marker gave rise to an explosive argument widely known today as the sheep herder theory. Sheriff Garrett was operating under immense political pressure from the powerful Santa Fe ring to finally produce a dead Billy the Kid. Proponents of this narrative argue that Garrett accidentally, or perhaps intentionally, killed an innocent drifter that night. They strongly suggest the victim was an unknown Mexican or Navajo sheep herder who simply had the extreme misfortune of being present at the Maxwell Ranch. The deeply suspicious, rushed nature of the burial and the blatant refusal to hold a public viewing look remarkably like strategic moves by the sheriff. Garrett desperately needed to prevent the local Hispanic community from getting a close, clear look at the body. They largely viewed the kid as a Robin Hood-like hero, and they would have instantly realized if the dead man in the wooden box was actually just one of their own. The Pecos River floods and the shifting earth. Think about that for a second. The earth itself seemingly conspired to erase Billy the Kid. If you visit Fort Sumner today, you aren't standing over a grave. You are standing over a geological crime scene. The history of this cemetery is an absolute testament to the violent volatility of the Pecos River Valley. The town that William Bonney knew was literally washed off the map. In 1889, a massive flood ripped through the area, completely destroying the Maxwell house where the outlaw took his final breath. But the real devastation, the event that changed the historical landscape forever, arrived with the major inundation of 1904. This was not just a heavy rain. High-velocity water submerged the entire cemetery, severely altering the subsurface and aggressively scouring the alluvial soil. Every single remaining wooden marker was violently and entirely ripped away. The sheer hydraulic force of that 1904 flood gave birth to the terrifying missing bones rumor. Many historians and locals point to the massive volume of water and realize the terrifying historical truth. The floodwaters likely did not just wash away the surface markers. That water penetrated the loose earth of those shallow, poorly dug frontier graves. The rising water table would have easily buoyed those cheap wooden coffins, lifting them right up and out of the ground and carrying the human remains miles downstream. The skeleton of the most famous outlaw in the American West is likely scattered along the muddy riverbed of the Pecos. It firmly cements the idea that the modern gravesite is nothing more than an empty patch of dirt. Adding a massive layer of forensic confusion is the chilling Santa Fe mass grave controversy. Following these devastating floods and the general abandonment of the old fort, the United States Army stepped in. In 1906, they undertook a massive project to recover military remains from the ruined site. A contractor named Charles Dudreau was commissioned to locate and disinter 22 military personnel for relocation to the Santa Fe National Cemetery. Picture the absolute chaos of digging through ground that had been completely ravaged and scrambled by floodwaters. There is a high probability that displaced civilian bones, potentially including the kid himself, were indiscriminately scooped up during this chaotic recovery effort. Those scattered bones were gathered and blindly dumped into anonymous mass graves numbered 674 through 695 in Santa Fe. The primary subject of American Western mythology might be lying in an entirely unmarked military plot, hundreds of miles away from his legendary home. Millions of eager tourists visiting Fort Sumner today are looking at a complete visual fabrication. The current placement of the headstone is nothing more than a best guess placement. Decades after the floodwaters wiped out all the original markers, local old-timers were consulted. They tried to identify the location of the regulator plot based purely on their hazy memories of the pre-flood layout. There was no precise geographic surveying and absolutely no ground-penetrating radar used. This reliance on flawed oral history is completely invalidated by the scientific reality of forensic subsurface shifting. In the highly saturated, soft alluvial soil typical of a volatile river valley, objects as light as human remains can easily undergo significant subterranean migration over a century. Hydraulic soil shifting makes it completely and statistically improbable that the historical remains, if they even survived the devastating floods, are actually still located directly beneath the modern concrete and heavy steel cage you see today. Stolen tombstones and ironclad fortifications. It is the ultimate historical irony to take the greatest escape artist of the American frontier and permanently lock his gravestone inside a heavy iron cage. The physical markers representing William H. Bonney have endured an odyssey just as turbulent and chaotic as his actual life. For decades following the devastating 1904 floods, the site sat practically bare and entirely unidentifiable. The very first step toward establishing a permanent memorial did not happen until 1931. A dedicated local guide named Charles Uncle Charlie Four diligently saved up his tour tips to buy a marble stone bearing the word "Pals," honoring the 3 fallen outlaws. Then, in 1940, a Colorado enthusiast named J.N. Warner donated a 200-pound granite footstone declaring the deceased as the Boy Bandit King. You would naturally assume a block of solid granite would secure the site forever. Instead, that heavy stone became a massive target for obsessed thieves. In August 1950, the granite marker completely vanished from the cemetery in an event widely known as the 26-year disappearance. Think about the sheer audacity required to smuggle a 200-pound slab of granite out of a public graveyard without leaving a single trace. For over a quarter of a century, the whereabouts of the stone remained an absolute mystery. The saga took an unbelievable turn in 1976 when a former property owner in Granbury, Texas, miraculously discovered the stolen monument sitting right at his private residence. He immediately notified New Mexico officials, and the artifact was safely returned to Tobacco County. Everyone breathed a collective sigh of relief, assuming the saga of the stolen stone was finally over. They grossly underestimated the obsession surrounding the historical legend. Security remained a massive vulnerability, a fact proven during the brazen Centennial Heist. On February 1, 1981, exactly during the 100th anniversary year of the outlaw falling to Pat Garrett, determined thieves struck again. They aggressively cut through the heavy padlocks on the newly erected protective fence. This time, they managed to haul away an even larger 2,000-pound monument that had been placed to anchor the site. Authorities launched a massive interstate manhunt for the massive stolen artifact. Following an anonymous tip to the New Mexico State Police, investigators finally tracked the massive stone all the way to Huntington Beach, California. In an absolutely surreal climax to the exhaustive search, authorities found the immense monument hidden under a blanket right inside the bedroom of a long-haul trucker named Walter Nicholson. Tobacco County Sheriff McBride had to personally travel to Los Angeles just to escort the cultural hostage back home. This completely relentless and repeated desecration forced local officials into extreme measures, leading directly to the current state of iron imprisonment. To prevent any future thefts, the entire grave setup was totally encased in a brutal, heavy steel cage, and the actual markers were permanently set into massive slabs of deep cement. This aggressive fortification has completely transformed the site into a glaring visual paradox. A historical site dedicated to the ultimate symbol of wild, untamed frontier freedom is now entirely bound in heavy iron bars, ironically mirroring the historical subject's own extensive history of jailbreaks. Today, most credible historians and even the local Chamber of Commerce openly admit a stark truth about the modern setup. They confess these heavily fortified stones are strictly symbolic over literal markers. The cage provides a highly focused, centralized point for eager historical tourism, but it absolutely does not serve as an exact locator of the missing wooden coffin hidden underground. The 2003 exhumation attempt and legal blockades. Fast forward to the year 2003. Modern forensic science finally catches up to the dusty trails of the Wild West, and ambitious investigators are completely ready to pull the historic bones right out from the earth. You would naturally expect a community to embrace solving a century-old historical mystery, but these lawmen did not anticipate going to full-scale legal war with a small desert town desperately protecting a billion-dollar myth. The ambitious project was officially known as the Setterwall-Sullivan Initiative. It was spearheaded by Lincoln County Sheriff Tom Sullivan and his determined deputy Steve Cedarwall. They brilliantly sidestepped traditional historical preservation rules by framing the dig not as a mere historical curiosity, but as an official, 122-year-old cold case murder investigation. Their logic was sharp and legally binding. If forensic DNA science could definitively prove the person rotting in the Fort Sumner grave was not actually William H. Bonney, then Sheriff Pat Garrett would be guilty of the first-degree murder of an innocent man. This aggressive law enforcement angle immediately encountered a fierce tourism backlash from the deeply rooted local community. The residents of Fort Sumner survive on a local economy deeply tied to the Billy the Kid gravesite. It serves as their primary economic engine, drawing tourists from across the globe who pay to see the legendary outlaw. The prevailing fear rippling through the town was that a modern forensic investigation might actually prove the grave was completely empty. Whether due to the devastating 1904 floods washing the skeleton away or a historical corpse switch on the night of the shooting, an empty hole in the ground would bankrupt the town. This severe economic anxiety rapidly transformed into a vicious legal battle. Local officials in Tobacco County filed numerous motions to legally block the exhumation of what they fiercely considered to be a sacred and economically vital asset. The brutal court injunction that followed served as a massive blow to the ambitious investigators. A New Mexico judge officially stepped in and legally blocked the dig, citing a complete lack of legal standing and zero historical justification. The court firmly ruled that the modern sheriff simply did not have the necessary authority to aggressively disturb the dead for a murder investigation where the prime suspect, Pat Garrett, was already long deceased. Furthermore, the judge emphasized a devastating scientific point. There was zero clear and convincing evidence that Bonney was even buried at that specific site anymore, especially given the violently destructive hydrological history of the Pecos River Valley. As the intense legal battle escalated, severe accusations of rogue digging began to rapidly surface and destroy the project. The professional credibility of Sullivan and Saderwall was heavily damaged by hostile lawsuits and loud allegations from vocal critics like author Gail Cooper. Opponents claimed the lawmen were secretly conducting unauthorized excavations at other historical sites, such as the Pioneers' Home Cemetery in Arizona. They were accused of operating under the false guise of official police business while actually pursuing what critics branded a greedy, profiteering publicity stunt. This absolute public relations nightmare triggered the total collapse of the investigation. Lincoln County entirely withdrew its official law enforcement support, and the deeply cornered investigators were quickly forced to pay significant personal legal fees. The entire ambitious project was ultimately completely abandoned in late 2004, leaving the heavy iron-bound Fort Sumner grave completely undisturbed, but infinitely more clouded in dark historical controversy than ever before. DNA testing controversies and maternal tracing. Blocked at Fort Sumner, severely frustrated local investigators desperately needed a massive, groundbreaking pivot to keep the difficult case alive. They flawlessly executed a brilliant masterstroke widely known today as the Silver City workaround. If you cannot test the bones of Billy the Kid because a heavy iron cage and extremely angry locals are standing in your way, you simply test his mother instead. The underlying logic is absolutely brilliant. Forensic science relies heavily on mitochondrial DNA, a highly unique genetic code passed completely unchanged from a mother directly to her children. By securing that specific biological baseline, ambitious investigators could completely bypass the fortified tomb in Tobacco County entirely. They could finally bring undeniable, hardcore genetic science to the wildly chaotic legends of the violent Wild West. But frontier history, it seems, deeply loves a frustrating dead end. The bold plan rapidly materialized into a formal 2004 legal petition. The prime target was the physical remains of Catherine Antrim, the beloved mother of the incredibly infamous outlaw. She was supposedly resting quietly in Memory Lane Cemetery over in Silver City, New Mexico. Determined investigators desperately wanted to unearth her buried body to carefully extract that vital mitochondrial DNA. They had a specific historical artifact to test it against. Sitting down in Fort Sumner was an old, weathered piece of wooden furniture known as the carpenter's bench. According to deeply ingrained local lore, the kid was laid upon this exact bench immediately after Pat Garrett shot him in the dark. The dry wood was allegedly heavily stained with the dead outlaw's blood. A successful extraction from Catherine Antrim would finally create the ultimate gold standard biological baseline to accurately match against that dried human blood. However, the entire brilliant strategy immediately slammed into an insurmountable obstacle known as the relocation hurdle. Catherine Antrim tragically succumbed to tuberculosis back in 1874. She was originally buried in a completely different cemetery located right in the town center. As Silver City expanded, the town moved the graveyard. In 1882, her body was hastily transferred to Memory Lane Cemetery and carelessly dumped into a totally unmarked plot. By the time the 21st century rolled around, the exact physical location of her skeleton was a total mystery. The only available reference point was a cheap memorial marker tossed onto the grass in 1950. That marker was so poorly researched and lazily executed that it literally misspelled her first name as Catherine. Relying on that badly carved stone to find a specific skeleton in a massive field of dirt was absolute forensic suicide. The final nail in the coffin was a definitive judicial denial. A powerful judge firmly stepped in and permanently blocked the petition, ruling based entirely on the logistical nightmare of the request. Since the 1950 marker was historically useless, finding Catherine Antrim would require a highly destructive mass exhumation of the entire area. The court found it legally unacceptable to aggressively bulldoze dozens of innocent frontier graves just to satisfy a modern historical curiosity. This massive legal defeat cemented a tragic scientific reality known as the half-puzzle dilemma. Without the mother, the entire forensic investigation is permanently paralyzed. You could walk into a laboratory tomorrow and hand investigators the verified skull of William Bonney, and they could do absolutely nothing with it. There is zero maternal DNA available to match it against. Science is incredibly powerful, but it is totally useless without a baseline. The historically missing mother ensures the incredibly infamous son forever and always remains a frustrating ghost. The brushy Bill Roberts anomaly. What if I told you the boy bandit king did not die in 1881, but lived long enough to watch the atomic bomb drop in the deserts of New Mexico? Meet Ollie Roberts. The most enduring challenge to the official historical account of the death of William H. Bonney emerged from the quiet, dusty plains of Hico, Texas. In the late 1940s, an elderly man known locally as Brushy Bill stepped directly into the national spotlight as the definitive 1950 Hico claimant. He boldly asserted a deeply disruptive alternative history that turned the Western myth completely upside down. According to Roberts, Sheriff Pat Garrett never killed the kid in that pitch-black bedroom. Instead, the lawman knowingly shot and buried a completely different man, an unfortunate decoy named Billy Barlow, allowing the real legendary outlaw to escape deep into Mexico and eventually return to the United States living quietly under a string of complex aliases. This wildly controversial narrative gained massive public traction when it caught the highly focused attention of a dedicated probate investigator named William Morrison. Morrison diligently compiled an extensive, thick dossier of anecdotal evidence that seemingly filled the glaring historical gaps in the recorded biography of the outlaw. This extensive groundwork culminated in a highly dramatic and public plea for a pardon in November of 1950. Brushy Bill traveled straight to the Capitol in Santa Fe to stand face-to-face with New Mexico Governor Thomas J. Mabry. The aging man aggressively demanded the state finally honor the legal amnesty originally promised to him by former Governor Lew Wallace in exchange for his dangerous testimony during the bloody Lincoln County War. You would expect a triumphant vindication for the long-forgotten outlaw. Instead, the high-stakes meeting turned into a brutal and completely humiliating governor's dismissal. Roberts was over 90 years old and had recently suffered a debilitating minor stroke. Thrust directly into a chaotic and highly skeptical media frenzy, the fragile old man completely crumbled under the immense pressure. He was entirely unable to answer basic, foundational historical questions about his own supposed life to the satisfaction of the governor. Mabry publicly and harshly rejected the claim on the spot. The crushed claimant died just a few short weeks later in late December 1950. The sudden death of Ollie Roberts did absolutely nothing to bury his deeply polarizing legacy. His modern supporters fiercely championed the decoy corpse theory, arguing that Garrett purposefully buried a convenient substitute to collect the massive financial bounty while actively protecting his old frontier friend. Think about the modern scientific backing for a second. In 1990, highly trained facial recognition experts Scott Acton and Alan Bovick ran a massive comparative digital analysis. They discovered a staggering 93% biometric match between the weathered face of Brushy Bill and the legendary Diedrich Upham tintype, the only universally authenticated photograph of the kid. That kind of profound statistical match in a major forensic study is incredibly difficult to simply brush aside. Yet, firmly standing against that cutting-edge visual science is an absolute brick wall of genealogical debunking. Modern historians dug deep into hard family archives and unearthed unshakable federal census records alongside an original, verified family Bible. Those undeniable ink and paper documents prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Ollie Roberts was actually born in 1879. That stark reality means the man claiming to be the ultimate frontier gunslinger would have been a literal toddler during the height of the violent Lincoln County War. The John Miller exhumation. Brushy Bill wanted fame. But there was another man. A man with overlapping buck teeth, remarkably small hands, and completely fluent Spanish who quietly hid in the deep shadows of Arizona. And unlike all the other desperate claimants seeking public attention, his grave actually got dug up. While Ollie Roberts aggressively sought out cameras and a pardon, John Miller lived a remarkably quiet life. He was widely known as the Arizona claimant, a man who never once spoke of a famous identity for profit, financial gain, or public glory. He quietly passed away in 1937, leaving behind a highly specific physical legacy that completely mirrored the known traits of William Bonney. His close associates noted his undeniable physical features, from his distinct dental structure to his absolute mastery of the local Spanish dialect. His wife, Isadora Miller, actively perpetuated an incredibly detailed narrative known as the switched corpse legend. She claimed her husband was severely wounded in the chest that chaotic night at the Maxwell house. His loyal Hispanic allies allegedly hid him away to carefully recuperate, while they completely swapped his bleeding body with the recently deceased local Navajo decoy just before the rushed midnight funeral. Isadora was known to fiercely guard a heavily locked trunk containing supposed historical artifacts from her husband's violent past. Those items were kept totally hidden from the outside world. Think about the gravity of that situation for a second. A man who perfectly matches the unique physical description, holding on to secret artifacts, living in complete silence rather than chasing a lucrative myth. This incredibly compelling narrative led directly to a massive breakthrough known as the successful 2005 dig. After completely failing to penetrate the heavy iron defenses at Fort Sumner, investigators Tom Sullivan and Steve Setterwall managed to achieve the historically impossible. They actually secured official government permission to rip open a legally protected grave. The determined lawmen descended upon the pioneers' home cemetery located in Prescott, Arizona, and aggressively opened the earth above John Miller. This monumental event stands as the absolute only exhumation successfully completed during the entire 21st century investigation into the frontier mystery. The meticulous extraction of evidence was a total scientific success. The ambitious investigators successfully recovered physical human teeth and workable skeletal bone fragments from the Arizona dirt. They carefully preserved these crucial biological artifacts for high-level DNA analysis. They finally held the raw biological material they desperately needed to shatter the century-old narrative. But the entire high-stakes investigation abruptly slammed into a devastating, impenetrable veil of secrecy. After securing the physical bones, the official scientific DNA results were absolutely never fully released to the eager public. The lead investigator, Steve Cedarwall, only cryptically hinted to the hungry media that the scientific findings differed from history. He completely refused to disclose the hard genetic data, citing a deep desire to avoid further explosive conflict with established conventional historians. This absolute, infuriating silence leaves us staring directly at a terrifying modern possibility. The complete lack of transparency regarding those 2005 DNA samples continues to fuel massive historical speculation across the country. If the laboratory results simply proved John Miller was a delusional fraud, the investigators would have easily published the raw genetic data and closed the historical book forever.